On December 18, 2022, a United Airlines Boeing 777 took off from Maui, climbing steadily into stormy skies. Initially, the flight seemed routine, but that quickly changed. The captain noticed that the airspeed was increasing faster than expected. While trying to determine the cause, he briefly lost focus on the flight instruments and didn't notice that the aircraft was not climbing as steeply as intended. By the time he realized what was happening, the aircraft had already entered a steep dive, plummeting toward the ocean from just 2,100 feet. The ground proximity warning system blared as the pilots scrambled to regain control. Would they be able to pull the aircraft out of the dive in time? This is the story of United Airlines Flight 1722, title United 1722, Near Disaster in Maui. That afternoon, Flight 1722 was scheduled to depart from Kahului Airport and head northeast toward San Francisco International Airport, covering approximately 2,400 miles over the Pacific Ocean in an estimated 5-hour journey. However, the weather was anything but ideal. Heavy rain and warnings of low-level wind shear posed serious challenges. Despite these conditions, the flight, carrying 281 passengers and crew, was set to depart as planned. The captain, a 55-year-old pilot with over 19,600 flight hours, including 5,000 on the Boeing 777, was in command. The first officer, who had previously worked for Hawaiian Airlines, had 5,300 flight hours, but was relatively new to the Boeing 777, with only 120 hours logged on that aircraft. For this flight, the captain was the pilot flying, while the first officer was responsible for monitoring. As the pilots prepared the aircraft, the captain spoke with the purser, who mentioned that the earlier arrival into Maui had been turbulent. Meanwhile, the first officer conducted a walk-around inspection. Shortly after, he received a text from a friend warning him about a serious turbulence incident earlier that day. Hawaiian Airlines Flight 35, an Airbus A330 from Phoenix to Honolulu, had encountered severe turbulence, injuring 36 people, including 11 with serious injuries. This news underscored the unpredictable and dangerous conditions in the area. The first officer shared this information with the captain, ensuring both were aware of the risks. As passengers boarded, the pilots completed performance calculations. The airport's Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS, was unavailable, meaning the necessary data had to be obtained directly from air traffic control. The tower reported winds from the south at 10 knots. Based on these conditions, the pilots used a computer system called Sabre to determine the best takeoff settings. It recommended flaps 20 with reduced thrust, a setting less commonly used for takeoff compared to flaps 15. The first officer, still relatively new to the aircraft, might not have been entirely familiar with this setup. At 2:30 p.m. the aircraft pushed back and engines were started. The tower then informed them that the active runway had changed to runway 02. Adjusting for this change, the pilots decided to use full takeoff thrust instead of reduced thrust due to reports of significant wind shear. They taxied to the runway, activated the weather radar, and prepared for a turbulent climb. At 2:49 p.m. they received clearance for takeoff. The Boeing 777 accelerated down the runway and lifted off without issue. However, as they climbed, turbulence intensified and airspeed fluctuated rapidly. As they reached the thrust reduction altitude, the captain slightly lowered the nose to increase speed and called for the flaps to be set to 5. However, the first officer misheard and instead set them to 15. This small error set off a chain reaction of events that would soon put the flight at risk. The first officer contacted Honolulu Control as they climbed through 1,400 feet, receiving instructions to climb to 16,000 feet. The controller also warned of moderate to extreme weather conditions in all directions and authorized deviations as necessary. At first, everything seemed under control, but then the captain noticed the airspeed increasing more rapidly than expected, while the maximum operating speed indicator dropped lower than anticipated. Concerned about an overspeed situation, he manually reduced engine thrust. But then the captain noticed the airspeed increasing more rapidly than expected, while the maximum operating speed indicator dropped lower than anticipated. Concerned about an overspeed situation, he manually reduced engine thrust. This slight reduction in power caused the nose to pitch forward slightly, but the descent continued. The captain, focusing on the flap settings, initially failed to realize that the aircraft was no longer climbing correctly. The captain was convinced there was a flap malfunction since the expected transition to flaps 5 hadn't occurred. However, there were no warning chimes or system messages indicating an actual problem. A few seconds later, he realized the flaps were still at 15 instead of 5. He called for flaps 5 again and then flaps 1, but by then the aircraft's pitch had already decreased significantly, and the descent was accelerating. The first officer noticed the increasing airspeed and the unusual nose-down attitude. He asked the captain about the situation, but received no immediate response. The aircraft's descent rate surged to over 8,600 feet per minute. Dangerously fast, especially at such a low altitude. Suddenly, the ground proximity warning system blared, alerting them of the rapidly approaching ocean. Recognizing the danger, the first officer called out the warnings. By now, the aircraft had dropped below the clouds and the ocean was alarmingly close. By now, the aircraft had dropped below the clouds and the ocean was alarmingly close. The captain reacted quickly, pulling back on the control column while also applying maximum thrust as part of an emergency escape maneuver. Inside the cabin, passengers were thrown against their seatbelts as the aircraft suddenly dropped. Some looked out the windows and saw nothing but ocean. Panic spread as the aircraft continued to descend. Just as the situation seemed dire, the captain managed to pull the aircraft out of the dive at a mere 748 feet above the water. The Boeing 777 then climbed steeply at a rate of 8,680 feet per minute, and the warning alarms ceased. The crisis was over, but the ordeal had left both the crew and passengers shaken. One passenger later described seeing water filling the window, convinced they were about to crash. Screams and panic filled the cabin until the captain reassured everyone that they were safe. From the moment the captain took his eyes off the flight display to investigate the flaps until the aircraft reached its lowest point, only about 10 seconds had passed. In that short time, the aircraft, which had initially around 2,100 feet, had entered a rapid descent that nearly resulted in disaster. A few seconds of delay in their response would likely have led to a catastrophic crash. In that short time, the aircraft, which had initially climbed to around 2,100 feet, had entered a rapid descent that nearly resulted in disaster. A few seconds of delay in their response would likely have led to a catastrophic crash. Once the aircraft stabilized, the captain contacted the purser to check on the passengers and crew. There were no injuries or visible signs of damage, so the flight continued to San Francisco without further incident. Upon landing, the event was not immediately reported as there were no injuries or damage. However, 2 months later, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, learned about the incident and launched an investigation. By the time the investigation began, the cockpit voice and flight data recorders had been overwritten, limiting the available data. Still, the NTSB determined that the primary cause was a combination of the captain's momentary distraction and the first officer's misinterpretation of the flap command. The severe weather conditions and the captain's manual inputs further contributed to the rapid descent. Following the incident, United Airlines revised its training programs to emphasize clear cockpit communication, especially during critical flight phases. They also implemented an awareness campaign focusing on proper flight path management and adherence to standard operating procedures. Following the incident, United Airlines revised its training programs to emphasize clear cockpit communication, especially during critical flight phases. They also implemented an awareness campaign focusing on proper flight path management and adherence to standard operating procedures. This event served as a reminder of how quickly a flight can go from routine to near disaster, and reinforced the importance of precise coordination and communication in aviation safety.